Before I was reading the types of books that I read now, I used to read a lot of weightlifting books because I used to be a weightlifting coach. And I used to say that if I could read a whole book, even if it was quite long, and walk away with at least one thing that I could then implement into my coaching, then it was worth reading. And even though the books I read now are so vastly different from that, I kind of feel the same way. Not every single book is going to blow me away or fundamentally and completely change me as a reader or as a person, but most books will have some impact on who I am and how I read, even if it's a very small amount. So making a list of the top books that have changed me as a reader and as a human was very difficult to do. And especially when you have a knack for finding books that you seem to connect with on a regular basis. But I've tried to narrow this down to 5 books that have had a huge impact on me as a person and as a reader, and all for somewhat different reasons, which I'm excited to talk to you about. And we're just going to go in order of size. The first book on this list is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a very famous book of Latin American literature, considered like one of the pioneering works of the magical realism genre. And this came highly recommended to me from my podcast co-host, Andy. This is one of his favorite books. And to be honest, I wasn't reading a ton of fiction when I read this book. I was reading a pretty good mix of fiction and narrative nonfiction and history, with probably a slight advantage to the nonfiction. And so this was a pretty big departure from a lot of the things that I was reading. A lot of people think that this is a very challenging book, and a lot of people don't connect with it because they just don't understand what's going on. I'm not going to pretend that I understood everything that happens in this book, but I felt really drawn to reading more fiction after starting in on this book and being like, you know what, I think I have the hang of this. I kind of think I know what's happening, and I feel like I care about the characters and I care about the story, and so it made fiction more interesting to me. It also got me really interested in translated literature, and in particular Latin American literature. Not that this was the first work in translation I'd ever read, but it might sound kind of stupid, but like I never really thought of books like The Count of Monte Cristo or stuff by Dostoevsky as translated literature, even though it obviously is, because a lot of these books you are reading in high school or maybe college, and they're just so entrenched in the Western canon, and there's a million translations of them, you just don't really necessarily always think of them as translated works first and foremost. And one thing that 100 Years of Solitude did for me that some other translated works that I had read before didn't do was it really made me feel like I was getting a peek into another culture, which something like The Count of Monte Cristo doesn't necessarily feel like, because it is a very universally human story. It takes place in such a vastly different time period. You kind of just compress history down into like now and then. And so it doesn't feel like a different culture, but just a different time period, if that makes sense. Kind of the same thing with Dostoevsky. The philosophy in his books is considered to be universally applicable. So it's not so much about Russian culture specifically when you read a book like The Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment. And this did not give me that same sense. It really felt like, okay, I'm being transported to a different place that if I got on a plane right now, I could go and see for myself. And at this point, I'm certainly not an expert on Latin American literature, but having read this, I can now see its influence in some of the more contemporary Latin American works that I have read. And it's really paved the way for me to read those books, which a lot of them I've enjoyed. If you are intimidated by this book, I would highly recommend watching the Netflix adaptation. It is in Spanish, but it's very well done, and I think it will help give you a framework to read this book. Now, this next one is on the list for a much different reason than the others. I really love this book. It's fantastic. I recommend it to people all the time, but this is the book that convinced me that you don't need to talk about popular books on social media to have a successful social media account. And this is Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. Now, this was originally published in 1966, and I don't think it was really that popular when it came out. Don Carpenter's not really like a household name of American literature. He wrote maybe a dozen books. They're very difficult to find. This and one other are the only one that have been reissued. It's not like a book that you're just seeing all the time everywhere. And NYRB reissued this in 2009, and we spoke with the folks over at NYRB, and this book had sold about 3,000 copies in this edition, which is obviously not a ton, until I did a review of this, which at this point has garnered probably close to 5 million views across platforms, and the sales of this have been boosted like 10 to 15,000 since doing that review. And I can't take credit for all of that. There are a couple other people with big accounts that saw my review, decided to read it, and then they too read the book. But we obviously had a huge impact on the sales of this. On top of getting millions of views, I think it added probably 20,000 followers to my Instagram and another 20 to my TikTok accounts independently. So total of 40,000 people across platforms, which is pretty crazy. One of the complaints that people make about BookTube and Bookstagram is that the people are just reviewing a lot of the same books over and over again. And I think there's two reasons for that. One, I mean, people are reading popular books because they're popular, and then they become interested in them, so they read them, and then they just make content based on what they're reading. But I also think that a lot of people believe they have to read very popular books or make videos about very popular books to see any kind of success on social media as a book influencer. I just don't think that's true, and I think this book proved it. And so this really changed my approach, because at the time, I was kind of under that belief where I don't want to read books just because I think that they're going to do well as videos on social media, but I was trying to kind of pack in some more popular books to help bolster my account. And after reading this book, I thought, I don't think it matters. I'm just going to read what I want to read, and I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. And that overall has been very positive for my reading and positive for my social media accounts, because I do think the most important thing for anybody who's making content about anything is that you're genuine about it. Now, this next book is my claimed favorite book of all time, and it is Catch-22. And it's not on here just because it's my favorite book, but this book did have a huge impact on me as a person and as a reader. When I started getting more into fiction, I'd always been interested in history, particularly around World War II history, but I hadn't read a lot of fiction on that topic. And although this book isn't explicitly about World War II, that is the setting for the book. And what I loved about Catch-22 is it took this very serious topic like war, particularly the Second World War, and it satirized it, which I don't think is a very easy thing to do. And I really love serious books, and that's something that hasn't changed over the years. I think I probably prefer serious books over funny ones, but this book is incredibly funny, and so it really got me interested in books that can satirize serious topics. It really got me into appreciating fiction about World War II, where I had previously only read history of nonfiction about World War II. It also helped to introduce me into postmodern literature. And so a lot of people don't necessarily categorize this as postmodern, but I think it firmly is in that kind of literary movement. And I think one of the reasons why it doesn't get categorized as postmodern is because of how popular and successful it was. And that's not a dig at postmodern authors, but they just typically have not had the commercial success that writers of other genres or movements have had, but this one was wildly successful. This is also the type of book that really made me love fiction, in the sense that I had read some fiction, I had liked a lot of the fiction that I had read, but my favorite books were still firmly non-fiction picks. But this is a book that I thought, holy crap, if this is what fiction can do, I need to read more fiction. I'm also definitely due for a reread very soon. We're moving on to the only nonfiction on today's list, and there's a lot of incredible nonfiction books that I could talk about. I'll probably do those in a separate video, but I had to include this one in a top all-time impactful books list because this really changed me, not just as a reader, but as a human being. It's If This Is a Man / The Truce by Primo Levi. If you're not familiar with Levi, he was an Italian Jew who survived the Holocaust at Auschwitz. And he was a chemist, which really had a big role in his survival because, unfortunately, people that had a little bit more of a skill set or just more usefulness to the Nazis in general, They were typically given more favorable living conditions, not to say that they were good. And so he was able to survive the Holocaust because of who he was, because of luck. But this is, in my opinion, one of the best Holocaust memoirs that exists. Primo Levi was an incredibly bright person, and so the writing is razor sharp. His command of language is fantastic. The translation reads buttery smooth. And this man pulled absolutely no punches in writing this, because it wasn't just the people in the camps versus the Nazis. It was literally a situation where it quite often became every man for himself, which was by design. They wanted to strip these people of their humanity and just create the most barbaric conditions that they could. And so he gives you a very, very close-up look at what life was like in the camps. It's an extremely challenging read from an emotional standpoint. This book changed me in several ways. First, it got me more interested in World War II and Holocaust history. I read this before any other book on this list, so this is the least recent read for me. And, I wasn't completely ignorant to Holocaust history and World War II history. Where I went to high school, we had theology as a required class every year. But our junior year was dedicated to Jewish studies, which primarily focused on the Holocaust. So I had probably a little bit more of a Holocaust education than kind of your average teenager coming out of high school. But I think when you're in high school, you just don't really absorb all of the things that you are shown, because you just don't have like the relevance for it or the emotional maturity to understand what you're learning about. So coming back to this subject through this book as an adult was just a very different experience for me, and really got me interested in how human beings could do this to one another. I think it also had a huge impact on my empathy as a human being, which maybe sounds a little weird that a book will do that to you, but I really feel like this was a line drawn in the sand where I just became a much more empathetic person after having read this book. This is also one of the first non-weightlifting books that I ever read that I really started to take extensive notes. You can see that I highlighted quite a bit in here. And the way I used to do it is I would highlight and then I would take a photo of the highlighted passage and upload it to a Google Drive folder, so I had all my notes on hand for quick reference and journaling and things like that. So this was really the first book where I started to take up that practice for something other than like a tactile piece of knowledge, like a training method from a weightlifting book. I said I was due for a reread on Catch 22. I think that's doubly true for If This Is a Man. In fact, I might actually try to squeeze this in before the end of 2025. There is no audiobook of the English translation of this, which really breaks my heart. I don't know if that's something like I could do and put it out there. I'd have to like look into that, but the thought crossed my mind. So if you'd be interested in that, let me know. Okay, the last book on today's list is probably my least favorite of all the books I've talked about so far, but it was still very important to put on here because it really changed me as a reader, probably more than any of the other books on this list. And that is The Tunnel by William Gass. I only just read this last year, and to be honest, this isn't even my favorite William Gass novel. I certainly liked Omen Setter's Luck more than The Tunnel, and I recently finished Middle C for our book club, which I'm still kind of processing. I'm not sure what to make of it, and I'm not sure if I would rank it above or below The Tunnel, although it is a very different book. But one of the reasons why I love this book, and one of the reasons I put it on this list, is because that people say that this is one of the hardest and most challenging books to read. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I did think it was challenging, and I could see why people think it's very challenging. But I kind of look at this as a marker in my reading life, or an acknowledgement of just how far I've come as a reader. Now, reading isn't supposed to be this thing where it's just about the skill and constantly reading more and more challenging works and then just becoming a stronger, better reader. But that is a nice bonus side effect to reading a lot and reading a lot of challenging books. Because when I read this, I thought, Yeah, it's a challenging read, but I didn't think it was like that hard. And that's not to say like I'm some super smart person. It's just that it really signified that, wow, I've done a lot of reading at this point and I've kind of honed my reading chops to make a very difficult book at least approachable or more approachable. So what makes this book so challenging, supposedly? Well, I think there's 3 or 4 different things that really make it a hard read. First and foremost, it's got that classic Gass style where there's no quotation marks or regular indication of who's speaking and when and to whom. So it can make the reading feel a little bit disjointed or fractured or confusing. There's also a non-linear narrative, so we're jumping from different time points, sometimes within the same paragraph or page. It's not clearly like this chapter happens then, and that chapter happens at this different time. So it can be a little bit hard to keep track of what is happening and when it's happening. The third thing that makes it challenging is it's a very heavy subject matter. It's about a university professor, and he's basically like a closeted fascist. And he's just angry at the world. He hates his wife. He hates his kids. He hates his parents. He hates his coworkers. He hates his students. And so he's just a miserable guy. And he's like recounting his miserable life and all the things he hates about humanity. And so it's just very bleak and dark and gross. And the last thing that makes it challenging is the typesetting. So you could probably classify this as ergodic literature, meaning like it uses some type of aesthetic choices or design features beyond just like the words themselves to tell the story. So you have stuff like this in there where these are all like tickets printed on the page. There's a lot of text in very odd shapes. Let me see if I can find some for you. There's all these weird graphics like this. This might be hard to see, but this is like the word shot is repeated 3 times above each of these lines. It's very strange. The words are kind of arranged like a funnel that gets narrower at the bottom. There are whole pages in here that are written in cursive, which is hard to read. Gass had actually said in an interview that he wanted this book to be published, at least the outside cover, on like the paper of like a grocery bag. And obviously the publisher was like, yeah, we can't do that logistically, like we can't make that work. So there is one page in this book that is kind of printed in that weird kind of texture that way, and then the ink is all kind of bled on it, so it makes it very hard to read the words. So there's just a lot of strange stuff in here. But this is the type of book that after you read it, you kind of start to have that belief like, I can read anything. Books don't really intimidate you anymore. You're not afraid to just jump into a difficult work. You don't fret about, oh, do I have the right translation? Or are there any prerequisites that I should read before this one? Or do I need to have a reading guide to be able to understand what's going on? Not that there's anything wrong with any of that. Like, I still use those tools all the time, but it just gives you a lot more confidence to read a book like this, particularly when you read it and you go, yeah, I get it. Like, that wasn't over my head. That wasn't the hardest thing I've ever read. That wasn't the hardest time I've ever had reading. It just inspires a lot of confidence. So there you have it. These are 5 books that really changed me as a reader. I would love to know which books you put on your list and why. Leave them down below. And if you'd like to see me do a specifically non-fiction version of this list, let me know.